Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the Children's Room.
We're having another conversations. We're traveling the world discussing myth and legends from various places. We're in the middle of African mythology at this point. So I've talked about the Orishas, I've talked about Anansi, some of the Yoruba things. So I'm heading right now to South Africa and I'm talking about the Zulu.
Okay.
Yes, the Zulu are a famous, very great group of people. They have a long, storied history.
So South Africa, what
Yeah.
countries would that include?
I'm not sure actually.
Okay.
Country of South Africa for one thing, and all the area around there. The problem is that historically they didn't have boundaries to their countries. But we consider the Zulu nation as actually like several different groups of people who are all gathered together. Plus, anthropologists divide people up by their language groups.
Yes.
So there's like 5 or 6 groups that are considered to be Bantu, even though they themselves are broken down into different groups and don't consider themselves related to this other group at all, even though they speak the same language.
Right.
To an anthropologist, they're part of the same ethnic group, but they themselves don't feel that way.
Gotcha.
The Zulus originally were an extremely small group. They had a leader known as Shaka Zulu. I'm not sure if you've heard of him.
Yep.
He's very famous. He organized the Zulu and turned them into a fighting force, and they were able to conquer all the surrounding territory, and everybody they conquered became Zulu.
Okay.
So they went from being a very small group to being a very large group and encompassing a lot of people who lived in the area. Like most parts of Africa, they have a very long and storied history. It's a lot of mythology, a lot of folklore comes out of there. Unfortunately, like I've said before, it's all an oral history. It hasn't been written down. Much of it has been lost over the years because the Zulu Empire was shattered in wars against the Boers and the British, and they broke apart and reformed a couple of times. So a lot of it's been lost over the years. Doing research on the internet and finding books and things like that, there's precious little information about some of the Zulu stories, which is very sad. There's also, like with several other things, there are several different versions of each story, so there is no definitive version of these stories. You could find several different versions, many of which are wildly contradictory to each other. The stories are still being told to this day. They're still very important to people that live there. And as I always say, as my disclaimer when I start, I'll probably mispronounce something along the way. These names and these words are extremely beautiful, but I have a very hard time pronouncing some of them.
That's fair.
So we'll see how well I do today. Zulu is apparently the most commonly spoken language in Africa, it says in Wikipedia. So,
Okay.
all right, so their mythology starts. They don't really have a creation myth per se. In the earliest version I could find of the creation myth, the world already exists. And there's the earth, and there's rain, and there's plants growing. And there are reeds. Everything is a vast sea of reeds all across the world. And one of the reeds gets bigger and bigger, and the top of it gets thicker and thicker, and it turns into a person, a man. Not technically a man, he's androgynous. He represents all living things, so he's neither male nor female. And his name was Nkulunkulu. Now Nkulunkulu keeps getting bigger and bigger until they burst out of the reed and they drop down to the ground. And all around them they see other reeds that are getting bigger and bigger too. And so they break those reeds open and other people pop out. And so they populate the earth, and Nkulunkulu wanders around finding all these reeds and breaking them open. And before you know it, he's put animals onto the earth and found different kinds of plants and things like that. So gradually he populates the earth. He's often described as the first human being rather than a god, even though he plays the role of a creator god in almost every other mythology.
So that sounds very similar to what I used to do with milkweeds. You break them open and you watch them fly.
I'm sure if I knew more about the kind of reeds that grew in Africa, this story would make more sense to me. All these local stories I have a hard time getting into sometimes, but that does make sense. Now there's other versions that say there was a creator god who made Nkulunkulu. Other authorities say that the Zulu had no concept of a higher god until the European missionaries arrived. So it's possible that their mythology was changed to try to match what they were being told by the Europeans.
To say that they had no concept, I almost take personal offense, like just any human being.
Well, Kulu performs the role of a creator god in every possible way. He just comes into existence from a plant that already exists without him. But he does create all the people of the earth, and he populates the earth. He finds all the animals. He spreads plants around the world, and he teaches people how to cook and how to plant food and things like that, how to raise cattle and so forth. So he's a cultural character too. So he does all those things. He also has tremendous powers. Now there's several different takes on this story. He wants to tell the people of the earth that, like him, they will all be immortal. And so he takes a chameleon and tells the chameleon to go tell the people that they will never die. The chameleon is kind of like, poking along really slowly, and then Kulu starts to get, impatient. So he grabs another animal and sends him out. Now in some versions of the story, he gives the second animal a different message to tell. And in some versions, the creature he picks, which is a lizard, it just lies. Yeah. So, and in some versions, it's a race. So it's a chameleon and a lizard. And the lizard is much faster than the chameleon.
All of this sounds very accurate.
Yeah. So the chameleon's just going along there, and this lizard comes like racing past him. And the lizard gets like the first village and announces that all of mankind is doomed to die. They will all die at some point. So the lizard brings death into the world. By the time the chameleon gets there, it's too late. It's already been done. So the moral of the story is, don't trust important messages to chameleons. But to this day, the chameleon is so ashamed that he doomed mankind to death that when you look at a chameleon, he'll like disappear and fade into the background. You can't even find him. That's how embarrassed he is by this whole thing. Yeah.
Okay, well.
Yeah, so all of mankind is like doomed to die. So that's more or less their creation story.
So they associated death with doom versus just a natural part of the process.
Yeah, originally nothing died until that lizard did his whole thing.
Okay.
He literally brought death into the world. There was no death until the lizard. Now, Christian missionaries tried to reinterpret this myth by saying that the lizard was Satan and that the chameleon was Jesus. I'm not sure if the Jesus as chameleon metaphor really works, but that was their version of it anyway.
Well, the ability to adapt, I suppose. You could draw some parallels.
You could say that, yeah. The Zulu have a whole pantheon of gods and goddesses, most of which I can find out almost nothing about, which is very, very sad.
Then how do you know that, in fact, there's a whole...
I can find lists of them online. But looking up the individual gods and finding all my mythology books, like this one here, there's like a paragraph, or sometimes even a sentence is all that there is on them.
Wow.
My mythology sense is telling me there's a whole lot of untold stories that haven't been recorded yet. They may have never left Africa, they may have never been written down. But the fact that they have so many deities that have names implies that they have stories and personalities, like the Orishas did. But there's almost nothing known about them.
What about like African heritage museums here stateside? Would they not have some of this material?
That could be a good source. Most of the things that have been written down, I had access to. So it's definitely, if I had more than a week and a half to research this, I could find out more things. They have a goddess named Inkanyamba. Now, Inkanyamba is the goddess of rivers, but she's also a giant eel monster. Because if you search Inkanyamba online, all you find is the cryptozoological websites that talk about her as a monster. Now, she was in fact an evil goddess who would drown people and eat them. So the fact that she's now remembered only as a giant monster, it may be fitting somewhat, I don't know. Most people assume that the monster they're referring to is actually a giant eel, which they do have in that part of Africa. They can get to be very big and they're very dangerous, but she also, they believe these eels can travel from one body of water to another by changing into a tornado. So Inkinyamba is the goddess of rivers, but she's also the goddess of storms.
Well, that's not terribly far-fetched because you had both, I don't know if it's alligator or crocodile, but that and the Titanoboa.
Mm-hmm.
They were just ridiculously larger than the animals that we have, present day.
Exactly. And when you think about it, a tornado twists around in the air much like a big eel would twist around in the water.
Right.
They look very similar. So whether there are any stories where she actually has a personality or a background, we don't know. She's only remembered today as a river monster. There's also Inyanga. Inyanga is a goddess of the moon and a goddess of healing. Now, she's famous because right now, healers in Africa who use traditional herbal methods and things like that are called Inyanga after her.
Oh.
She's the goddess of healing, and her name is still, used all the time to describe these traditional type of doctors. The Inyangas are different from a Sangoma, who are the other healers in Africa. The Sangoma mostly talk to spirits and predict the future and things like that, whereas the Inyanga basically deal with natural herbs and healing processes like that.
So just the equivalent to what we would know as holistic.
Basically,
health
yeah.
providers.
Those are the two healing arts in South Africa.
Okay.
Fortunately, there are a few deities that we know something about. There is a goddess known as Mbaba Mawana Waresa.
That's a mouthful.
It's a great name. However, she's also known as Namkul Bulwani. Namkul Bulwani, also a mouthful. I'm going to call her Mbaba because that's easy for me to pronounce.
Okay.
She's the goddess of rain, of farming, of harvest, and fertility. When you hear thunder in South Africa, it's Mbaba playing her drums to bring rain, life-giving rain to the earth, so crops can grow.
Cool.
Also, in the very few depictions of her that I've been able to find, she is definitely drawn or sculpted as a very voluptuous, full-figured woman.
Well, fertility.
Exactly. It's quite the contrary to our Western culture that skinny is beautiful. She's extremely beautiful, but she's a fertility goddess.
Mm-hmm.
Then you want your fertility goddess not to look like a bag of skin and bones. So she was a very cool goddess. She's also the goddess of rainbows. In fact, she lived in a hut up in heaven, and instead of support posts, she actually had a rainbow holding up her hut. Very cool.
That's cool.
However, she was lonely. There were a lot of gods who were interested in her, but she wasn't interested in them because they were too primitive and warlike. She wanted something better than that. And one day she heard a cattle herder on the earth singing a song about how much he loved the land and how beautiful the land was. She thinks, well, I'm the earth. So she wanted to come and see if he would be a good mate for her. But the problem is, he's immortal, and she's a goddess. So she had to decide some way to test him so he could prove his worth to her. What she did was she went to the nearby village and found the most beautiful maiden who was there. I convinced her to come out where the guy was tending his herd in the field and try to entice him a little bit. And then she showed up, but she used her shape-shifting power. She can also change into any form. Used her shape-shifting power to become an old crone. And so we saw the two women together in his field at the same time. But fortunately, his love for the earth was so great, he immediately saw that the crone was the truly beautiful one. And she was, of course, very impressed with that trick. So she took him up to heaven to marry him, and he became her husband. However, all was not well, because the other gods were extremely jealous that she would lower herself to be with a mortal and she could be with one of the gods. And so they were causing a lot of trouble. So she decided she had to find some way to make peace between, her husband and the gods.
Did their union make him immortal?
I'm not sure. People are kind of fuzzy about that.
Okay.
She brought him up to heaven to live with her, so presumably, yeah.
Okay.
So she had to do something to calm things down. And what she came up with was she invented a drink that no man or god could resist. She got some cornmeal and some malt and mixed it with sorghum and heated it all up until it fermented. You're laughing already. Yes, she cooked it for 3 days and she made the world's first beer, because she is also the goddess of beer. And so she invited all the male gods into her place, and she handed out these big, mugs of beer, and much beer was drunk, happiness all around. And then they decided the guy from Earth wasn't so bad after all.
That's usually how it goes.
Yeah,
to
the
this
Zulu
day.
beer, which is both made in the traditional way by many families and in big breweries, is still being done to this day. It is you make it in your own home. It's part of a ritual process that you have to go through. They say they test the beer to see if the fermentation is good. While it's fermenting, they light a match over it. And if the match goes out, then it's good beer. Because it means it's fermenting so much that the carbon dioxide is putting out the fire. Wikipedia describes it as thick, creamy, and somewhat gritty because of the cornmeal. Which doesn't sound all that different from some lagers I've had in Ireland, so, And also, the other reason why she's famous, apart from beer, is that every year in South Africa, they have a big ceremony which is named after her. It's called the Nabakul-Bulwani. And the Nabakul-Bulwani is done by the teenage girls in the village every year. It's their coming out ceremony. And this was done annually for 200 years until the missionaries wiped it out. They just could not deal with that. And disappeared for like several decades, and finally in the 1990s, as a way of reviving interest in their traditional culture, it was brought back again. And now it's done every year faithfully.
Would that be similar to, and I'm going to mispronounce, Kinsinterra?
I'm not sure.
Do you know what I'm referring to?
No.
Okay. We'll put a pin in that one.
Yes, we'll come back to that. So in the 90s, they started doing it again. They did it. They even did it this year. They all had to wear masks. So it's that important a part of their tradition. They didn't even stop doing it during the pandemic, which hit that part of South Africa pretty hard.
Wow.
And that's all the information I can find with quick research on the Zulu deities.
Okay.
They're pretty awesome.
So a good starting point.
It's a good starting point. But even in my encyclopedia of storytelling and folklore here let me down. Wikipedia is pretty much useless. Even the websites that people from South Africa don't have a lot of information.
So it sounds like both a mystery and a challenge.
It is. There are enough deities that have names. I suspect there's a deeper mythology at work here, but I can find no evidence of that.
All right, well.
So yes, we'll continue our search next week, and we'll have more exciting dives into the world of mythology. Until then, I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
We'll see you next time. Until then, be safe.